Hey there, Peter Temis, founder and president of the Institute for Innovation in Large Organizations. I want to talk a little bit about critical knowledge. We were asked to do a project a couple of years ago from our friends at NASA. A fellow named Ed Hoffman was at the time their chief knowledge officer. We were doing a lot of work with him. Wonderful guy, now on the faculty at Columbia University. Ed came to his job in an interesting way. In the 80s, you may know about the Challenger accident, quite a trauma on live TV, a bunch of astronauts going up in the space shuttle, including the first teacher in space, Krista McAuliffe, perished when a very important system, failed, just as Challenger was heading out into space. And a lot of Americans saw it on live TV. A lot of school children saw it because the idea of a school teacher going into space was such a thing to celebrate at the time. Ed was then running the Project Management Academy inside NASA. Congress mandated that NASA create a chief knowledge officer, partly so that mistakes like this won't happen again. There was a very specific failure of knowledge, and of that knowledge being visible to key decision makers. Ed became the first chief knowledge officer for NASA because of this. He did great work in that role for quite a number of years, and he asked us to look at this notion of critical knowledge. How can we know which knowledge is critical under which circumstances? And one of the first things our research told us that we were able to share with NASA was the issue about critical knowledge is just mired with all of these potential mistakes. One mistake is to assume that some knowledge simply is critical and other knowledge simply isn't. And the real issue is how knowledge becomes critical and then ceases to be critical. You may be in an organization where your knowledge management, your strategic process is slow enough that you've got guidelines for investing, guidelines for operating that are based on what was critical last year and not what's critical this year. So the key in managing critical knowledge is not necessarily to be able to say this knowledge is more important on the pyramid, everybody has to know this, or this knowledge is less important so we don't have to watch it that closely. Far more important is to understand how and when and under what circumstances knowledge that was not critical a moment ago has become critical. That's key. So you need to have that dynamic sense. My dad, who was a community college professor of electrical technology, had one of those little telescoping antennas on his car. In the old days, went through a car wash without putting it down and it came out bent. And all his students began bending their little car antenna. Why? Because they figured, oh, Professor Temis knows something about, he was teaching electrical communications technology. He knows something about how that antenna shape is going to get you better reception. No, he just made a mistake. The fact that he was viewed as an expert, that he had more knowledge than his students, made them make that false assumption about whom to trust. That is one element of foundational critical knowledge. The stuff that the last generation of leaders, or that you a week ago understood deeply because of your experience to be foundational to do what you do, can narrow the focus of what you learn, how you train, what you pay attention to. That's the trap of foundational critical knowledge. Related to all this is the idea of how we think differently when we're playing defense or playing offense. Knowledge management is very different when we play offense, and here's what I mean. In the simplest image of organizing to meet a challenge, if you are the feudal lord in your big castle and armies are coming against you, you've got to defend every door. Your issue is they only have to succeed once and destroy your whole perimeter. You have to succeed every time because only one point of entry that they control can change the whole game. If you're an attacking army, if you are one of 5 attacking armies attacking that fortress, you don't need to send memos to each other. You don't need to make sure every possible line of assault is covered. Because you're attacking, you simply have to find that one critical pathway that can change the whole game. Knowledge management, if you can frame it as a game of attack rather than a game of defense, it's much better. So, for example, you're looking at that space shuttle on the launch pad. Instead of saying, look, there are 7 million moving pieces inside this machine, let's make sure we're covering them all. That's the defense mode of knowledge management. If instead you say, hey, let's black hat this, what's changed that might change that one place where I can make a failure happen? And if you come up with a plausible answer, you've now discovered a change in the criticality of knowledge of that one potential failure point. So what makes knowledge critical is key. You don't want a static model of how critical knowledge is critical. You don't want to say this is the important stuff and this isn't, and boy, that's a very big trap because it feeds into this kind of competence bias. We tend to want to replicate things that have worked for us in the past. But you also want to make sure that as you create this model of how some knowledge becomes very important, how some knowledge becomes critical, that the model itself can change. It would be another big mistake if you say, oh, we now know when these three things happen, knowledge that was less important becomes more important. But a month from now, in the world of AI, it may be that it's no longer those three things. It's two of them and one more from over here. So there are three levels to really understanding how to play this game of critical knowledge, right? One is you're far better off organizing your knowledge in an offensive rather than a defensive mode and playing that black hat game all the time systematically. Two, you have to avoid the trap of saying that, hey, we know the static value of this knowledge, it's critical, and the static value of that knowledge. Instead, you need a dynamic model. How does knowledge become more or less critical? And then number three, how does that model itself of criticality, of how knowledge becomes more or less critical, change? It's a lot to keep in mind. You can diagram it out. We can help you do it. Hope this was valuable. Thanks very much.